Welcome, Mr. Mosher. I would like to cut to the chase with the first question that I have to ask you. You have first experience from the population control in China. Could you tell me what were the worst surprises in your experience, in your research, and maybe also what were the best surprises? That means, where did you find that these policies were not being implemented and the rules were not being obeyed?
In 1979, I was finishing a doctorate at Stanford University in California, and I was selected to be the first American social scientist allowed to go to China. Since 1949, so for 30 years, China, the People's Republic of China, had been hidden behind the bamboo curtain. And I was on the ground in China by March of 1979. I quickly found that there were massive human rights abuses of all kinds being committed by the Chinese Communist Party. First and foremost of those abuses involved the one-child policy. The one-child policy began when I was in China, and of course it was a policy that for 36 long years restricted almost everyone in China to one child. And what I saw in China was women were being arrested for the crime of being pregnant with a second or third or fourth child. They were being forcibly aborted of those illegal children. Sometimes the women were in the 7th, 8th, and 9th month of pregnancy, just days or weeks away from giving birth. Sometimes babies were actually killed as they were being born. So there was forced abortion, infanticide, and forced sterilization. So I left China in 1980. I lived altogether in Asia for 10 years. I speak, read, and write Chinese and Mandarin and Cantonese and Taiwanese. And so I left China determined to expose these human rights abuses to the world. And I've been engaged in that struggle ever since. My commitment to pro-life work intensified and grew in 1991 when I joined the Catholic Church. I'm a convert from atheism to Catholicism, partly because of what I saw in that operating room in China, where women were crying and begging officials to let their children live, and yet army doctors from the People's Liberation Army were performing cesarean section abortions on them. And during the course of that abortion, I realized what an abortion was. It was the taking of a human life, the taking of the life of a tiny son of Adam, a tiny daughter of Eve, who had done nothing to deserve a death sentence, who had done nothing to deserve being killed, other than the order of some distant dictator in Beijing who had decided that China had too many people. Over the course of the last 40 years, there were 400 million abortions performed in China. Many of them were performed on women under duress. They were forced abortions. They were coerced abortions. They were enforced abortions. And by 2016, the Chinese Communist Party, 35 years later, finally realized that it had made a terrible mistake. They finally realized that there were too few babies being born in China. They finally realized they had a labor shortage in 2016. They needed 4.1 million more workers than they had. Where were those workers? Those workers had been killed before they were born. And so in 2016, the Chinese Communist Party finally said, to the people of China, you are now free to have a second child. And guess what? The birth rate barely changed, because after 35 years of anti-baby, anti-life, anti-natal propaganda, the young people of China had decided that they didn't want to have more than one child. In fact, many of them didn't want to have any children because the Communist Party had inoculated them against the idea of having children altogether. And so last year, in desperation, the Chinese Communist Party said to the Chinese people, now you are free to have 3 children. Be fruitful and multiply. And again, the Chinese people, the young people said, no, we don't want 3 children. We don't even want 2. You told us for decades that 1 child was the limit. So there has not been a baby boom in China. The birth rate has continued to decline, and there are now in China as many voluntary abortions, not forced abortions, but voluntary abortions, as there are live births. And the birth rate continues to fall. Fewer and fewer babies are being born each year. More and more young people are choosing not to get married and not to have any children. And at the end of the day, I'm very worried that the Chinese Communist Party, Father Elias, will decide to do the opposite of what it decided to do in 1980. In 1980, it decided to force down the birth rate by any means possible. In 2022 or 2023, it may decide to force up the birth rate by any means possible. They're already encouraging young communist cadres to get married and have 3 children. They're already arranging marriages for young couples to encourage marriage. They're already organizing dating groups and dating apps on smartphones. But if that's not enough, if the birth rate still stays low, I think we will see in China forced pregnancy. Really, the opposite of what we saw in China for decades, forced abortion, will be replaced by forced pregnancy. Young women in China will be told they must, for the good of the party, for the good of the country, have children, and the Communist Party will insist that they do so. I'm very afraid that that is the future for young women and, of course, young men in China, Father.
That's quite amazing to hear that. It's the first time I hear that. Now, you've talked about the Chinese Communist Party. The ideology is sort of imported from the West. Could you indicate if the population policies of the Chinese government are immediately related to institutions, organizations in the West?
Yes, the idea of overpopulation obviously came from the West. One of my colleagues, former colleagues at Stanford University, was a gentleman by the name of Paul Ehrlich, who wrote a book called The Population Bomb, which in 1968 predicted that by 1970 we would see massive famines all over the world. Of course, that never happened. We look back 50 years ago, and what we see instead was a green revolution where India, for example, instead of having famines that kill tens of millions of people, actually began to produce enough grain to feed itself. The worst famine in human history, interestingly enough, occurred in China in 1960 to 1962. And did it occur because there were too many Chinese? No. It occurred because in 1958, the late chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao, as we called him, forced all of the farmers in China into large collective farms called communes. All of the land in China, the private land in China, was taken away from the farmers and their families, and the farmers were forced into these huge people's communes, they were called. And when I say huge, I mean these communes, the one I was living in 1979 in South China, in the province of Guangdong, had 80,000 people, all farming the land in common. And guess what? No one owned the land. The Communist Party officials in charge of the commune really didn't understand farming. And the farmers who'd had their land taken away from them weren't very energetic in planting and harvesting crops. And when the crops were harvested, the government, which is to say the Chinese Communist Party, took all the crops away from them and sold them down the river to Hong Kong. And they paid the farmers of China, the people in the people's communes, only a fraction of what their crop was worth. So naturally, under the people's commune, where everyone was first forced to work in common, everyone was forced to eat in communal dining halls together, where all the women were forced to go out in the fields and work alongside the men, where all the children were taken away from the families and forced to join nurseries and live in dormitories, the family was completely destroyed. The family farm was completely destroyed, and the people spent all of their time in political study sessions. The end result was a devastating famine, not caused by bad weather, not caused by drought, not caused by a locust infestation, any kind of crop infestation. It was caused by the Communist Party's mismanagement of the agricultural sector of the economy. From 1960 to 1962, the worst famine in human history occurred in China. 42.5 million people died. That's a number several times the population of many European countries. 42.5 million people died. There were entire villages of people who died from this famine, to the last man, woman, and child. And they died because of the mismanagement of the Chinese Communist Party of the economy. Worst famine in human history was caused by politics. All right? So we move back to the population question. And in the 1960s and 1970s, a lot of people in the West were saying the world is terribly overpopulated. We must reduce the birth rate by any means possible. The Club of Rome published a report in 1976 saying that we're running out of petroleum, oil, natural gas. We're running out of zinc and chromium and iron ore and copper and all of the other minerals. And to stop this exhaustion, this using up of all of the Earth's resources, we must decrease the population of the world. There was a Chinese scientist in Europe in 1978, right after that report came out. He was close to Deng Xiaoping, who was then the leader who had replaced Chairman Mao. And he came upon this report that the world was overpopulated and was running out of resources. And he thought it was the latest and greatest in Western science. And so he took it back to Beijing, and he met with Deng Xiaoping, China's senior leader at the time, and said, the world is running out of resources. We must reduce our population. And Deng Xiaoping said to the engineer, Song Jian, Engineer Song, what should we do? And Engineer Song said, we have to reduce the population of China from 1 billion down to 600 million, and we have to have a one-child policy. So the one-child policy was conceived in the West. It was born, however, in China, using, of course, the mechanism, the instrument of the Chinese Communist Party to impose it on the Chinese people. So that's where the one-child policy was created in the minds of Western intellectuals. And I will tell you that today, Father, 40 years later, it is very clear that the destruction of 400 million babies, 400 million of the most productive, hardworking, enterprising people on the planet Earth was a terrible, devastating blow to Chinese society, to the Chinese family, and to the Chinese economy. It was the wanton, uncontrolled, devastating destruction of the most important resource of all. The ultimate resource is the human being, the human mind, the human spirit. The ultimate resource is not oil or natural gas or copper or anything like that. The ultimate resource is the one resource created by God, and that is the human being with an intelligence and an immortal soul. And by killing 400 million of this tremendously important resource, China has made itself poorer and less developed than it otherwise would have been. A great historical mistake.
When you've talked about the countryside, is there a difference as far as application of these policies is concerned, between the countryside and the cities? Are there regions where the population control is not being implemented, or is it like all over the place in the same way?
Well, in the 1980s, when I was in China, and continuing to the 1990s and the early years of the 21st century, the one-child policy was strictly in place throughout that period of time in the cities. In the countryside, in the late 1980s, it began to be relaxed a little bit, and so some couples were allowed to have a second child. But again, today, for the last 6 years, people in China have not been limited to one child. They've been allowed to have 2 and now 3. The problem is, Father, that no one wants to have children. And there's another problem. The killing of little girls in China for 35 years reached endemic proportions. It was pandemic proportions. There were millions upon millions of little girls killed in China by female infanticide after birth, and by sex selection abortion before birth. They would do an ultrasound. Chinese parents would do an ultrasound, and if the wife was carrying a little boy, they would celebrate. They would be happy. If the wife was carrying a little girl, they would have an abortion, because they were only allowed one child, and to carry on the family name, to support them in old age, they wanted that one child to be a son. So there are tens of millions of missing girls and women in China today. There are tens of millions of young men in China who will never be able to marry because the women they would have married were killed before birth or after birth. So there's a disparity in the Chinese population. There are more men than women in China today. And what that means demographically is that there are so few young women of childbearing age in China today, so few young women in their 20s and 30s and 40s, because so many young women were killed after birth and before birth, that every young woman in China would have to get married and have 3 children or more in order to stop China's population from decreasing. And I don't believe there is any way that those young women in China will voluntarily have 3 children. Many of them don't want to get married at all, much less have children.
What will they try to do with, tens of millions of young guys? That's quite astronomical. It's unimaginable. Does the government have any policy for them? Do they foresee this?
Well, the one-child policy, by destroying the family, and remember, the one-child policy went on for 2 generations. So the first generation under the one-child policy, born in the 80s and 90s, have no brothers or sisters, for the most part. The second generation have no cousins and no aunts and uncles. They have two parents, a father and a mother, and four grandparents. And that's all. The family tree has had all of the branches cut off. Four grandparents for every two parents for every one child. And many of those only children were boys, young men now, older men now, who are called bare branches. They're called bare branches because they are branches that will never bear fruit. They're branches that will never get married and have children because their women, the girls they would have married, have been killed. Now, you can understand how socially destabilizing such a situation is. When you have a huge excess of men, what happens? Well, in China, what has happened is crime rates are going up because young men are not able to get married. They do not have the stabilizing influence of a wife. They do not have the responsibility of caring for children. And so they remain barbarians. Women, civilized men, but the women are gone. So the men remain barbarians into their 20s and 30s. They also seek alternative families. And what kind of alternative families do you seek? Well, one kind of alternative family is a gang, because the gang members are your brothers, the brothers you never had, and the gang leader is a father figure. So the gang, they join the military. The brotherhood of the military is another substitute family. They also seek women from overseas. So there is tremendous sex trafficking in China today as a result of the one-child policy. Young women from North Korea, sometimes only 15, 16 years of age, are brought in. Young women from Vietnam, from Burma, from Pakistan, from all of the neighboring countries are brought into China because there is a shortage of women, and Chinese men are willing to pay large sums of money in order to buy a wife. So another consequence of the one-child policy is human trafficking, sex trafficking on a massive, massive scale.
It's all very difficult to imagine, given the size of these phenomena. I'd like to just go a little bit in, let's say, a metaphysical direction. Do you see a continuity between, let's say, the ancient ideologies of China, like Taoism and Confucianism? I don't know whether you call them religion or ideology, but do you see a continuity between them and the modern Chinese society, culture, if you like? Not just in communism, but maybe also already with the nationalism at the beginning of last century. Do we see a continuity?
Well, you know, Father Elias, this is kind of a long and complicated question because China has a 3,000-year written history. As far as Taoism is concerned, Taoism has mystical elements, but Confucianism, interestingly enough, does not have mystical elements. It does not have a supernatural element, a metaphysical element. It is purely a means of social control. It is purely a means of regimenting and controlling society. Confucius himself was once asked by one of his disciples, do you believe in ghosts? Do you believe in spirits? And what he says was, watching are you enter, which means I respect them, but I keep my distance. He said he didn't want to talk about the metaphysical. He was purely interested in designing a means by which the government, in those days the emperor, could control the people. And so he said, the people are the children of the emperor. They have to treat him as their father and obey his wishes. Younger brothers have to obey older brothers. Teachers have to be obeyed by their students. Wives have to obey their husband, and so forth. So it was a means of social hierarchy. But underneath this, Father Elias, is something that few people know. Underneath this silken costume of Confucianism, where everybody bows and kowtows because that's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do to bow to the emperor. It's the right thing to do, Confucius says, for the younger brother to obey the older brother and for the wife to obey the husband and so forth. Underneath that is another philosophy. It's called legalism, fa, and it is an early form of totalitarianism. Legalism is an ancient Chinese philosophy of government. And what legalism is the idea that all power should be concentrated in the hands of the ruler. And so by the time China was unified in 220 BC, under the first emperor of the Qin dynasty from which we get the word China, all power was in the hands of the emperor. He had a secret police. He had concentration camps. The concentration camp inmates built the Great Wall and the Great Canals of China. He had secret police in the army, political commissars to watch the army. He had propaganda troops that went around the country singing the praises of the emperor. He claimed to be a deity. He claimed to be a god, so people would obey him not because he was a man, but because supposedly he was a god. We had control by the state of the production of iron and salt and other goods. So all of the things, Father Elias, that we associate with modern Marxist-Leninism were actually invented in China over 2,000 years ago. And it was a brutal dictatorship by the emperor who controlled the economy, the means of production, and controlled the people by means of a very, very widespread network of police and police informers and social control. Every village was organized into families of 10, and everyone was supposed to watch out for misbehavior, for any disobedience to the emperor. This went on in China over 2,000 years ago. And so we think of China as being governed by a Confucian system where everybody bowed to the emperor because he was the father figure, and that was what you were supposed to do. But underneath the silken costume of Confucianism was the iron scaffolding of legalism, where if you didn't bow to the emperor, you would be reported by your neighbors, the secret police would come, they would arrest you and punish not just you, but they would eliminate your family for 3 generations. So it was a brutal rule in China for centuries. And over the dynasties, sometimes the dynasties were more totalitarian and sometimes they were less totalitarian. But even the last dynasty, the Qing dynasty, which we also call the Manchu dynasty, the dynasty had these same mechanisms in place. So when the Communist Revolution came, and it was led by Chairman Mao Zedong, he looked at Marxist-Leninism and said, yes, that's a Western philosophy invented by Karl Marx and Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, but it also had deep resonances in Chinese history. And so it appealed to him not just because it was the latest in Western ideology. It appealed to him because this was, in large part, the way China had been governed over the centuries. And so the two met in the middle. And that's where we get the modern Chinese Communist Party.
I'm quite amazed to hear that, because in fact my next question was to ask you about the differences between the special services, as they are called in Russia, in Russia, and the control system in China. But you already gave the answer, actually. Is there the same level of, in the Chinese population, the same level of, let's say, capacity to escape from these secret services by a kind of inbuilt cultural anarchy, which you see in Russia?
Well, you know, if you ask the Chinese people what the proper organizing principle of society is, they will tell you, most of the Chinese people will say that the society should be organized by the government. So 2,000 plus years of fairly centralized government control has led the Chinese people to think that society can, many of them think that society should be organized by the government, and that in the absence of tight government control, there would be chaos and confusion. So it's a very different mindset than you see in the West, where if you ask Americans, for example, and perhaps if you ask the Dutch and the Flemish and other people in Europe, what the fundamental organizing principle of society, what the fundamental unit of organization in society is, most of them will say the family. In China, they will say the government. So it's a very different mindset. Not that there aren't dissidents in China, not that there isn't resistance to the kind of high-tech, digital dictatorship that is being imposed on the Chinese people today. Not that there isn't resistance to the pandemic lockdowns and the other controls that the Chinese Communist Party has implemented, but there is also at the same time a willingness to accept a level of control that, quite frankly, because of Christianity and because of the idea that everyone has a soul and everyone has free will, we would find unacceptable in Christian nations.
Well, Mr. Mosher, thank you very much for this first interview on EWTN Low Countries in our pro-life series, VitaDonum, Life is a Gift. Thank you very much for answering to your questions, and I hope I can meet you again in another interview, because there's many questions that are left.
I look forward to that, Father, and I should say in closing, I have a great love and affection for the Chinese people, and we need to pray that in the future they may be able to enjoy the first freedom, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, and without that, no other freedoms are meaningful and important.
Thank you for ending the interview with such hope. It gives us something to pray for.
There's always hope, Father.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.